Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our soil health journey. My name is Katrina Stacey, and I'm a communications coordinator for NACD. Beth Mason, our NACD North Central Region representative, will be co-moderating this session with me. In this Soil Health Symposium, we're going to take a journey exploring various topics of soil health, including research, economics, implementation, and policy. If at any point during this session you run into technical difficulties, please don't hesitate to reach out to us using the chat feature so that we can get those resolved for you. The first stop on our journey is going to be with Dr. Cristine Morgan, who is the Chief Scientific Officer for the Soil Health Institute. Prior to joining the Institute, she was a tenured professor of soil science at Texas A&M University in College Station, Texas. She is a fellow of the Soil Science Society of America and served as a member of the Soil Science Society of America Board of Directors. She also currently serves on the board for the North American Plant Phenotyping Network. I'd like to turn things over now to Dr. Morgan so she can get us started on our journey.
Hello, I'm Cristine Morgan and the Chief Scientific Officer of the Soil Health Institute. I'm happy to join you all here today, and I'd like to thank Katrina and Beth for their invitation for me to share what's going on at the Soil Health Institute. Particularly, I want to talk today about our research, which includes the more traditional thought of soil science research, as well as economic research, and also our outreach at the Soil Health Institute. All right, at the Soil Health Institute, our mission is to safeguard and enhance the vitality and productivity of soil through scientific research and advancement. And to do this, we have quite an extensive team of scientists. Wayne Honeycutt and myself are soil scientists at the Soil Health Institute, and we also have Sheldon Jones and Byron Rath on the administration team. Along with them, we have many soil scientists, and much of the work that I'm going to present to you today was provided by some of the scientists listed here. And all these different scientists, we have soil scientists, we have an ag economist, we have agronomists, and biogeochemists. So we have really quite an array of people looking at ways that we can affect adoption of soil health management practices. I always like to put this up just to maybe show off a little bit as a soil scientist. It's exciting to do soil science research and be involved in outreach and soil science information, because soil science is so important for a lot of our global existential challenges that we deal with today. I put a few of these up here, and I think everyone that's involved in agriculture understands how soil's incremental in addressing some of these challenges. Particularly these days, we have the challenge of climate change adaptation and climate change mitigation with sequestering carbon in our soils. But of course, soils are always a key component in food, water, and energy security. They're important for our biodiversity and in our human health, because we know many of our antibiotics and biodiversity are found in the soil. And I just want to reiterate what soil health is. You know, we all talk about it, but I just wanted to take a moment to reflect that the soil health is the capacity of soil to function and, function to support farming, living ecosystems that sustain plants, animals, and humans. And what does that really mean? And I think this picture is a good description of soil health. Here we have the same exact soil, and this barbed wire fence indicates that there's different management on each side of the soil. On the left-hand side, it's row crop, and the residue is returned, and it looks like a no-till system. On the right-hand side, the vegetation, there's no armor on top of the soil from previous crops, and there's still a crop form. But on the right-hand side, we see very different water cycling going on. In the background, you can see some erosion happening. The water is puddling at the top. It looks like the soil is kind of getting a little bit of a crust, and as it dries, that will surface seal. Whereas on the left-hand side, after this rainfall, the water has infiltrated. And I think that this is just a great example. Same soil, different health. There's another example I like to show where we can get down and look at the actual soil profile. Again, two different managements. This is a grazing system. But if we look at the soil profiles of the soil on the right-hand side versus the left-hand side, we see different soils. On the right-hand side, we see a darker, thicker A horizon, It's got different structure. It's a little more granular, which probably means that it's cycling water. It also means that it's storing carbon, and we can tell that by the color. And so here we have, again, same soil, different management, and one is functioning better for carbon and water cycling and probably nutrient cycling as well. And that's the way I think about soil health. Every soil can be healthy, even soils that we think aren't particularly agronomically productive. But if they're functioning to the best of their capacity, they're healthy. And if we look across the United States, we understand a lot of the management practices that can help soil become healthier. One is reducing disturbance. An example of that is no-till. And the other is cover cropping. The other is keeping live roots in the system. And an example of that management is cover cropping. But if we look across the United States, this is the 2017 Census of Agriculture. And we could see in no-till that there's states like Tennessee that have very high adoption rates of minimizing disturbance. And then there's just quite a variety across our agricultural states of adoption of no-till. And there's also a huge variety of adoption of cover cropping. And the interesting thing, you can see these numbers are lower, and this is percent potential cropland that has a winter cover crop on it. And it ranges substantially. And though we've had a doubling of cover crop acres from the 2012 census to 2017 census, cover cropping is still not well adopted. And so the question is if we know what healthy soil looks like, and we know that healthy soil functions better for agricultural purposes, and if we know what are the practices for improving our soil health, why aren't we adopting? Why are we so slow to adopt it? And of course, there's a lot of reasons. I've just thrown a few up here. From a soil scientist point of view, I would just love to think that slow adoption is due to, we just need better knowledge of the soil and how to measure soil health. But I know that's not true. I also know there are other drivers that are social and economic, and possibly even policy drivers. And so we have to recognize this and think about how we can improve adoption. And that's what we do at the Soil Health Institute. We have a comprehensive strategy at the Soil Health Institute to increase adoption in soil health management systems. But we know at the crux of this choice for adoption is this black box right here in the middle, and that's the producer decision. People that manage soil have to decide to change their practices to improve their soil health. Otherwise, it just won't happen. And when we think about, adoption, we know that you talk to anybody that works in agriculture, and we know that the number one reason for decision making is the business case. So at the Soil Health Institute, we're looking at the profitability of adoption. And once soil health management systems are adopted, how does it change the calculus of the economic risk, drought resilience, land valuation, and ecosystem service markets? So these are kind of some of the things we're looking at. Today, what I will bring to you is that very first bit is the business case on profitability. What is that on-farm balance sheet look like after a farmer has successfully adopted soil health management practices? And a lot of this business case, you can see we have done it through working with the NACD and Soil Health Champions. We're also measuring soil health. We think, we have to have easy, clear, standard ways to measure soil health, and then so that we can monitor it. I'll talk a little bit about that today. And of course, there's a strong education training component so that people get the information out there and allow easier access to this kind of information. There are other components in our comprehensive strategy that I won't be talking about today, but one is quantifying the impacts and additional needs after soil health management practices have been adopted, what research development and understanding the microbiome, obviously communications and consumer education on what it means for farmers to be practicing soil health management systems, and then taking all of this information and forming policy. So first, I'd like to talk about measurement. And we have this project that we affectionately call NAPSHM, the North American Project to Evaluate Soil Health Measurements. And the goal of this project is to identify the most effective indicators of soil health and to evaluate soil health indicators on long-term research sites. And that was kind of the approach that we took, because we wanted to be able to look at replication and long-term research experiments where we know where the management has been well documented. So we started out on this journey with getting together soil scientists, and particularly scientists that work in soil assessment laboratories, and talked about what are all these indicators and what are the, what are the measurements that perhaps we should be making. And really what it came down to is there were two groups of measurements, these tier 1 and tier 2 measurements. You can find these on our website, but essentially tier 1 are these widely considered effective ways to measure soil function. And then tier 2 are these other indicators, primarily those associated with microbial behavior or direct measures of the microbiome that we're trying to incorporate and understand more robustly how they're responding across the continental United States. So here I have not broken these down between tier 1 and tier 2. I just didn't want it to get that complicated. This slide is enough as it is. But with the way we think about the measurements that we took, we thought about measurements that are associated with carbon cycling in the soil. So of course, the top measurement is soil organic carbon. And then some of these other measurements you might be familiar with because you've seen them offered at the laboratory, such as this active carbon or potentially permanganate oxidizable carbon, respiration, both 24 and 96. 96-hour respiration or CO2 release is what the Cornell lab does, and 24, I think Ward and many other labs do as well. It's in the Haney test. And now we look at some of the enzymes associated with carbon cycling. We want to look at different extractable carbon, and then ultimately this microbial biomass carbon. Again, with nitrogen, looking at the total nitrogen, a standard method of looking at how much different parts of the nitrogen can be extracted. It's much like the active carbon. We're looking at this ACE protein nitrogen, potentially mineralizable nitrogen, just an anaerobic way in the laboratory to look at how much nitrogen is possibly mineralizable in the growing season. Again, we're looking at the enzymes associated with nitrogen cycling and then different extracts of nitrogen. My favorite, I'm a soil physicist, so I'm very interested in water cycling, as you could probably tell from my pictures before. But I'm really interested as well in what's that plant available water? How is that changing with soil health management? How's the infiltration changing, that saturated hydraulic conductivity at the surface? What's the bulk density? What about water stable aggregates? And I'll share a little measurement about that today that I think is fairly intriguing, especially for practitioners to monitor soil health on their own. And then when we get to this community, the microbial community, that area is just exploding right now in science. There's so many different tools now to measure and monitor our microbial community, and we just wanted to evaluate those as well. And so here is a picture of North America. It's colored by the climate moisture deficit. So warmer colors are drier areas and cooler colors are wetter areas. And these black dots represent the 124 locations that were selected. These are the long-term research sites that we actually measured. And at each of these sites, there's generally a control or a local cropping system, business as usual control, and then the addition of soil health management systems, primarily no-till, cover cropping, addition of organic amendments, and there's one more, and I'm not thinking about it, but it'll be on the next slide, so it's okay. Just note also that we didn't stay in the contiguous United States. We also selected sites in Mexico and Canada to really get a full representation of the climates of North America and the soils. All of this methodology I just covered now. I was really brief and very fast. If you are interested in looking at some of the methods more closely, it's in this paper that has been published in Agronomy Journal, and it is open access. So you can just Google Norris Napeshem, N-A-P-E-S-H-M. Norris is the first author. Charlotte Norris is one of our scientists. And if you just Google those two words, it would be the first hit on Google or any other web browser. Okay, so I just wanted to share some of the data. I'm a scientist. I can't not show slides and with graphs. So this is an example, and I told you that most of our treatments would be here, and here it is, decreased tillage. So that includes going from a conventional chisel tillage to no-till and reduced tillage. Add addition of organic nutrients, increased number of cash crops. That's one I couldn't remember, crop rotation, and the use of cover crops. And so the next graph I'll show you, and we did this for all those measurements. In this example down here, it's change in total nitrogen. And the way you read these graphs is that the mean of all those treatments is the black dot. So for decreased tillage, here's the mean of the treatments right here. There were 161 treatments that were measured across North America. And the line here, the vertical line that comes down to 0, represents the business as usual. So it's all been normalized. And essentially what this means, that if we had a treatment that decreased tillage and it was compared to its control, that on average, there was a 10% increase, right here, 10%, in change in total nitrogen. And the whiskers give you kind of an idea of the variation. So when the whiskers cross the 0 line, it's not a significant difference. So you can see that as we decreased tillage, added organic nutrients, there were significant increases in total nitrogen across all of these sites. As we used cover crops, we had an increase in total nitrogen for 23 of our treatments, but it wasn't quite significant. And as we increased crop rotation, there was really no change in our total nitrogen. So I think this makes sense to most. It's unfortunate, you know, we'd love to have seen this increase in total nitrogen for use of cover crops, but cover crops did affect the carbon. So, and that's shown here, just to give you another big picture. So a lot of these were some of those carbon measurements. I know everyone's interested in their soil organic carbon measurement. And here's that active carbon that you see in some of these soil health tests, 24-hour respiration and 96-hour respiration. Again, here are the treatments, rotation diversity and crop count. So rotation diversity is like a corn soy rotation is more diverse than like 2 monocot rotation, like a corn wheat, even if there is one such a thing. Residue retention, that's taking care of that residue on the surface and returning the residue back to the soil surface. Organic amendments, cover crops, and decreasing tillage. So to increase our soil organic matter, residue retention, organic amendments, cover crops, and decreased tillage all significantly increase the soil organic carbon of our soil. And that's a huge indicator of improvement of soil function and soil health. Same with active carbon, same with 24-hour respiration, and not quite with 96-hour respiration. So this is just some of the ways that we evaluated those measurements. Another cool measurement I want to share with you is aggregate stability. Aggregate stability is one of the more common soil health measurements made, and it's just an indicator, right, of that aggregate, especially on the soil surface, and how it's going to stand up to wind and water erosion elements. So the more stable the aggregates, the more resistant they are to erosion, and of course that puddling that can happen on the soil surface. And of course it also indicates water cycling, the activity of the microbes. You know, it's kind of this big integrator of a lot of soil functions. And what we did is there were a lot of different ways to measure aggregate stability. So we looked at them all. And as you can see here, so the colors in this bar graph are row crop and perennial, and then the green is grass perennial. And on the y-axis is just aggregate stability. And the letters C, B, A indicate that A, grass perennial, had significantly stronger aggregate stability than integrated row perennial, which was significantly stronger aggregate stability than the row crop. And all of our measurements showed that same trend, but some of the measurements were statistically significant from others and others were not. The Cornell rainfall simulator was the most sensitive measurement of aggregate stability, where all the different treatments were statistically significant. And the Slake's app couldn't quite tell that, you know, what a row crop was a row crop to it, but it was definitely, well, I'm sorry, the row crop was significantly different from the perennial grass and the integrated perennial systems. So that's just, you know, an idea, but I kind of wanted to focus a little on the Slake's app because it's something you can do at home. In fact, my daughter just used it for her science fair project this year. And what we do, it's an app that you can download to your iPhone or to your Android smartphone. And it looks kind of like this, and there are instructions on it. But essentially, you put an aggregate into water. This example is a Petri dish. My daughter and I used a white sheet of paper and Tupperware, and we stuck these pea-sized soil aggregates. And you see, as you in the water, they change size as they kind of slake apart. And what happens is the phone actually films that increasing in the slaking. So I'm going to run this video. So look on the right-hand side here, where you see the fingers holding the aggregate. Aggregate drops in the soil and it poofs apart. And that's what the phone app measures. And it just looks at the initial size and the final size after 10 minutes. And it calculates the aggregate stability. So this is kind of a fun one. And I think it's something that if you're interested, you could monitor your aggregate stability and compare it to your other fields of different management and soil types. Okay, let's see, go forward. And I just wanted to say, you know, one of the reasons why I wanted to show that aggregate stability is sometimes when we take all of these measurements that are used in the scientific community, they're not all transferable. And the transferability and the relevance of the measurement really depends on the stakeholder. And so we just have this little word picture of who we consider our stakeholders to be at the Soil Health Institute. Clearly, farmers and ranchers are our #1 stakeholders, but of course, the whole agricultural system is its own microbiome or biome of stakeholders. And we want to recognize that some people may be more interested in carbon cycling, some more in water cycling, and obviously farmers and ranchers are interested in that holistic soil functioning. However, I know being from Texas, the farmers we work with in Texas are very interested in how their soils are capturing water and reacting to erosive water processes. In Texas, when I was a kid, a 5-inch rainfall was like a pretty big, exciting deal. And the last couple of years I lived in Texas, we'd have multiple 5-inch rainfalls in a day in the summer and in the winter. And so, you know, with changing of our weather patterns, it's very clear that aggregate stability and water cycling in agricultural systems gets pretty important. And so the way we look at these measurements, this is kind of probably a too complicated table to put up, but I just wanted to give you guys the big picture of how we were dealing with this framework. We have all these measurements, and so that's a subset of those measurements are right here in black on the table, the first column in the table, and I've already talked about a lot of those. And then what we have on across the top of the table are these, you know, these functions that we find are really important for soil functioning in agriculture. So we have water storage, water movement, carbon storage, carbon cycling, nitrogen cycling, and erosion resistance. And what we were thinking about is like, okay, well, what are we going to measure? So for water storage, plant available water is a very nice direct measurement of water storage, and we can measure that. But what we also found that if we measure the clay and silt content and we measure the soil organic carbon, then we can model it very well. So it really just depends on, you know, what is the cost investment in wanting to know our plant available water? Do we want to measure it directly, or do we want to model it as it increases with soil organic carbon? Water movement, we got to measure it, saturated hydraulic conductivity, but that measurement is really variable. So we're probably not going to recommend it for a standard soil health assessment just because the variability is so high. It was very hard to see statistical differences, but it's still a pretty nice measurement to make over time. And I know that any of you that work with NRCS probably already measuring it with what I call the beer can method, where you just put something on the ground and you look to see how fast your water drops. Carbon storage, obviously we can directly measure soil organic carbon, but we also know the context of that change in carbon is going to depend on our climate, how hot and how much rainfall a particular area gets. We also know that it's also dependent on the texture of our soil. So there's some contextual pieces of information that we might need to know if we want to set a target for how much carbon we think the soil can hold. Same with carbon cycling, looking at that respiration as an indicator for that. Nitrogen cycling, we know that potentially mineralizable nitrogen is a great standard way to look at the indication of how much nitrogen can be mineralized, but we also have found other less expensive measurements that can model that phenomena. And with erosion resistance, you know, all about aggregate stability. And I really like that SLAKES app. However, Cornell's aggregate stability test looks to be more statistically sensitive. So it just really depends on, you know, access to the funds to get that aggregate stability measurement made, or if you just want to do something at home on your own. So what does it mean, like when we come up with these standard soil health measurements, which we were planning to do at the Soil Health Institute in the next couple of months, you know, how do we use this information? And that's what I've really been wrapping my head around in the last couple of years. And the idea here, so here's 2 pictures of soil. And once again, it's my like same soil, different management scenario. So these are 2 soils in Pendleton, Oregon. On the left-hand side is a wheat fallow mobile tillage, kind of 80 pounds of nitrogen an acre, business as usual treatment. On the right-hand side, we call kind of our reference site, maybe our target soil health, which is a perennial grassland. But we understand that row crop situations may never reach that target. Though I do challenge farmers. They're a pretty innovative crowd to figure out how to get there. So we don't want to erase the challenge from the table. And then we have our soil health management system, which is some wheat pea rotation under no-till. And so the question here is, like, how do we evaluate the soil health of this wheat pea rotation? And one of the ideas we came up with is we can measure these different standard soil health indicators. So for an example, this is total organic carbon. So how much carbon, how much organic matter are you putting into your soil? This business as usual treatment was about 0.8, and since we had replication, we have a standard deviation. The soil health management practice of the pea wheat rotation with no-till, it's climbing up there. It's almost, it has doubled its total organic carbon from the business as usual. And then there's that target, right? That elusive, can you get there in a row crop situation target, which is 2.2. And I would say that soil health management system is getting really close. Here's an example, the rotation, respiration, same thing, you know, where is it in that zone? And then there's that aggregate stability. We can see, I'm showing SLAKES again, so we can see that those standard errors are much greater, but that soil health management system's not touching that business as usual anymore. So we know we're going in the right direction, and we're even overlapping with some measurements that are being made in that perennial system. And that's our idea of the soil health targets. And we would like to do that for major agricultural regions across the United States. Provide farmers, like, you can measure where you are, but then there's also this measure of where you may be able to get to, you know, a goal. Other things that we are doing at the Soil Health Institute, I told you we can look at that water storage or that plant available water holding capacity. That's on this y-axis, and on the x-axis to represent changes in texture is clay content. And we actually took all of that data and we modeled how the plant available water content increases with increases in that soil organic carbon. And so we were really pleased to find some very nice significant differences as we go from 1, 2, 3, and 4% organic carbon. We are increasing our available water holding capacity, and it's very measurable and statistically significant. And we can take models like this and add it to things like Comet Farm, so we can enable prediction of changes in plant available water based on changes in soil management. And then lastly, I know everyone's very interested in that business case and what we're doing now. This is a project that is in partnership with the NACD and also with Cargill, where we're looking at that assessing the profitability of soil health management systems. So what are we doing? Well, in partnership with the NACD and funded by the NRCS, we have gone to 25 soil health champions. So these obviously are folks I think are on this watching this symposium today. We interviewed their business case. We said, okay, so what are your soil health management practices look like for a given crop rotation? And then what would they look like as a business as usual? You know, what is the local management practices that are being employed? And we did that with 25 soil health champions across the United States. So all of these states that are highlighted in red. And then we also looked at 100 corn soybean farmers, primarily in the Midwest. So we looked at Nebraska, Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Tennessee, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. I think Michigan too. And as part of those interviews, we asked farmers about some of their perceived benefits. And so the interesting part, you know, the colors just indicate these different states that we asked a lot of farmers in. But the most interesting part is this percent of farmers responding yes. So one of the questions that we asked them is, do your soil health managements improve your water quality? And it was like 100% yes, yes, yes. And then we asked, does it protect your license to operate? Absolutely yes. And then where we got some different perceived answers is, does it improve land, loan, insurance terms? And that seemed very state specific, probably due to policy. And does it increase your soil organic matter? And it was interesting, South Dakota, Tennessee, and Illinois farmers, well, actually, I should say South Dakota and Illinois farmers were very strongly feeling that their soil health management systems increase their soil organic carbon, 80 to 90%, whereas the rest of the field was right around 40% of farmers felt that increased their soil organic carbon. And then the interesting, you know, what people really want to know about is, what do those partial budgets look like? And so again, this is kind of what they're going to look like. So this example is a cotton wheat fallow, and we have these expense categories. And again, all you're seeing are differences. You're not seeing the total expenses, just the differences from the adoption of the soil health management system. So in this particular case, we see from additional costs of the soil health management system and pesticides and inputs. And then we have equipment ownership that is different between the two systems. And then additional returns. In this particular case, the farmer perceived that their cotton yield was greater by 400 pounds. So anyway, so in this particular case, the soil health management system reduced expenses by $61, had additional expenses by $31, and then had a change in returns due to yield. And overall, the net change in farm income in this example was $298 per acre. We have these for our, and are delivering that along with the interviews that the NACD presented. And this will be found on both the NACD website and on the SHI website. We'll have the fact sheets and the videos. So the fact sheets will have the economics, and the videos describe the management system from the farmer that we interviewed. And those will be coming along in the next couple of months. We also have farmer training going on at the Soil Health Institute. Particularly, we've been working with a program we call Healthy Soils for Sustainable Cotton, and where we're developing local technical specialists and farmer mentors help us with basic training and advanced training. And since it's been a COVID year, I would just direct everyone to our website for this. We have a webinar series on soil health management, that basic training. We have a cotton and covers, which is a lot of fun to listen to. It's just like this, it's 4 of our Healthy Soils for Sustainable Cotton farmer mentors talking about their cotton production and how they're using cover crops. There are virtual field days that are a lot of fun, and they're all here at this website, soilhealthinstitute.org, soil health training. And then more recently, if you're a cotton farmer, we have Healthy Soils for Sustainable Cotton Farmer Showcase. And each episode is going to be aired on a Tuesday starting January 26th at 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. And again, you can go to the same website to watch those episodes. With that, I just always want to remind people of our documentary called Living Soil. It's had a lot of views, and people have really enjoyed it. And at a time when you're at home with your kids, I've watched it with my kids. It's a great video. With that, I want to thank you for your time. And again, thank you, Katrina and Sarah and Beth for the opportunity to present to you today.
Thanks so much, Christine. Next up, we'll hear from NACD Soil Health Champion Jack Boyer from Rhinebeck, Iowa. Jack and his wife, Marion, own and operate a century farm producing corn, soybean, and seed corn. Jack is also a commissioner with his local soil and water conservation district. For a bit of on-the-ground perspective, I'd like to go ahead and turn things over to Jack.
Thanks, Beth. Want to talk a little bit about what my journey's been on pursuing soil health and coming along in that matter over approximately 10 years. And there we go. This is the Century Farm that Beth referred to that we do live on now, but the story I like to tell about this is that my wife's grandparents settled this farm and built the home, the basic part of the home that we live in. Her dad was born in the home, lived for 94 years having never left the home, and died in the home. And his philosophy was he wanted to leave the farm in better shape than what he received it. And Marion and I also share that philosophy, and he pursued it in different ways, but the way that we're pursuing it is trying to protect the soil and improve the soil for future generations on that farm. So I guess we started off with cover crops, and I think it's important when anyone wants to talk about doing cover crops that they think about what the reasons are. But you know, you see these rills that are flowing down through there. In a corn soybean rotation, you really don't have much there to hold it, and particularly when you're doing full tillage, often if you have any slope at all, you can see these kinds of erosion events, and more particularly you see them in the event of our changing climate structure, and that we get higher intensity rainfalls and maybe more frequently rainfalls as well. But when I see that, I feel like that, it makes me think about, well, you know, some of my investment in the land is washing away. Some of my nitrogen and phosphorus that I applied is washing away. And I've heard it referred to as, you know, it's kind of like, you know, you're taking money to the bank, but you got a hole in your bank bag, and all that money is just dribbling away. And I don't want that stuff going away for lots of reasons, but one reason is I paid for it. I'd like to get the use of it on my farm. So I started off on the journey in cover crops about 10 years ago, and as I said, you ought to ask what your goals were. So in thinking about that in that corn soybean rotation or seed corn soybean rotation, for me, you know, having my father-in-law believed we needed to pull out of the seed corn rotation every 7 or 8 years and plant commercial corn just to slow down the rate of decay of the organic matter and some of the other properties in the soil. And so my first kind of exposure to this is I heard Ray Archuleta talk, and he talked about you know, the erosion potential of it. And so I thought if I could get cover crops established, that might help me not have to pull out of that seed corn rotation. And so there could be some financial benefit to that as well. So I'll continue with that and started it on that, looking for erosion control and nutrient capture. But my primary goal in the beginning, at least, was to maintain the organic matter. So continue on with my journey, you know, in 2012, after seeing some things, I had some 160 that I had 50 acres flown on. And also in that, I started taking soil health soil samples of the Haney soil test and looking at, you know, what kind of difference might I see over that. And so then the next year I did 2 different farms. One was the same one I did in 12, and then added another one. And this time I used cereal rye. And one of the reasons for the change is that in my location, the annual ryegrass had not overwinter. And so the next year I tried another field of ryegrass, but also did cereal rye to see what if I could get some benefit on that, because I wanted that additional growth of having live roots in the soil, and then in the springtime before I got ready to plant, have those roots going and have some you know, both above ground and below ground going through that. So then I continued on and started adding some other species to the trial. And just each year I've tried some different things as we've gone along there, trying to see what other options there may be, and going through that and looking at that. And then the last, I don't know, several years, 4 years, I think it is, I've started to look at what are my opportunities to reduce some of my inputs in commercial fertilizer. And because my soils are very high in phosphorus, I apply very little phosphorus at all, except for just in some localized areas that are a little lower. And so there wasn't much opportunity to evaluate that. But I started looking at nitrogen to see what I could do with that. And so another trial that I had in the early days was to look at different termination dates in the spring and drilling soybeans into that. And so you see the picture in the upper left, that was the first termination, and it was like 9th of May, and then a week later or so I did the second termination, and I planted green. This was terminated a day after I planted it, and you can see kind of how high it looks on the tractor. And I can tell you that was an emotional event the time that I did that. My first chance of planting it green, and just, man, I'm going to get to do this again. But anyway, I had the trials and took a look at them and see what could happen. Okay, so then later in the summer, I had the the early termination, and then had these strips all the way across the field. It was no cover, and then the late termination. So this is kind of what it looked like in June. And this no cover area, all that green you see was not soybeans. They had mare's tail and water hemp in it as well. And what you see in either one of the cover crop strips, the green you saw there was basically soybeans. So doing stand counts, there was no significant difference in any of the stand counts. And talked about the weed pressure in the no cover area. So I went back and sprayed just the no cover areas, and left the ones that had the cover crop on them without any post spraying. And the chemicals plus commercial application of it, that particular year cost about $40 an acre. And I had about $30 an acre in the cover crop. So that put $10 back in my pocket. So that was a real encouraging thing of being able to show some financial impacts of having cover crops. So continuing along the path, looking at that termination date and moving in a few years, I went to 100% of planting green on soybeans, and later I've started to try to look at it in corn as well. But this is a picture of a machine that I had that it planted cover crops in between corn when corn was in the V3 to V6 stage, and trying to get that corn established, that cover crop established earlier. And so that it's there, it's ready to go when the corn starts to mature and dry down, that cover crop can take off and more reliably have a good stand in the fall. Because that's one of the problems we have behind corn, is usually by the time you harvest corn, you've lost so much sunlight and in the fall, so it's hard to get that up and get much growth in the fall. So this is another trial that I had done is getting that cover crop started earlier. You capture more nitrogen, you capture more, you have the ability to produce more carbon. So there's other benefits of getting it going earlier. And some other things that I've been able to observe and measure is that the ground temperature is much reduced if you have that cover crop growing between the rows. The challenge is that finding species that can survive between the corn rows, because in the summer that corn gets to be 12, 13 feet tall. It's really dark down in the bottom, but searching to try to find some species that can survive in that environment. So this is one of the trials I had there. So looking at mid-July, this was annual ryegrass, cowpeas, and rapeseed. And so even in mid-July, got some pretty good growth going there. And then this is after harvest. Well, we'd had a frost, and these cowpeas, I like to say that, if you get a hint that it's going to frost 3 counties away, cowpeas quit because they're a very warm season crop. So here you mostly see the rapeseed and the annual ryegrass that's going there, but you got some pretty good growth going. And then after harvest, still the rapeseed's coming on a little stronger, but they're hanging in there. But I still had the problem with the annual ryegrass that it wouldn't overwinter. So continuing on, looking at my nitrogen trials and continuing with that over a number of years. Before I started any of this stuff, some of the suggested inputs on nitrogen was, somewhere around a pound of nitrogen per bushel of corn. And at that time, we'd also take some credit for whatever you produced on soybeans. But anyway, we were applying about 220 pounds of commercial nitrogen before we started all this trial when we were doing conventional till. And anyway, so and at that 2017 is about the time that I went no-till on all of my corn ground as well as my soybean ground. And I'd done some trials previously with strip till against conventional till, and then no-till against strip till, and I saw no yield degradation in that journey to move to those different tillage types, and then going to no-till still didn't have it. So there again, there is money saved by fewer trips across the field. So then looking at the nitrogen, I was doing single reductions for a number of years, and then last year I did a 5-step on the nitrogen, looking at it. And all the previous years were statistically equal yields, even with the reduced nitrogen. And this last year, it was complicated by having a dry year, and I happened to be in the path of that derecho that went through Iowa and had some damage, wind damage, but the curious thing about that is that my field was 160 acres and it had very few stalks blown over. There was some that blew over, but I'd say 90% of them stood. And there's 3 cornfields on around me. Some of them had the same variety that I plant, and they went flat. And so I asked Iowa State University to assist, and Soybean Association as well, to try to see if we could determine what might have been the reason mine stood and everybody else's fell. If it had been a path across it, I'd say, well, it's just the wind. But it was square with the field that mine stood and the others went down. And anyway, their suggestion is that because of the no-till and the better soil health and the better soil structure, that allowed that corn to stand. Now you have to have a variety that doesn't break, but we had the same variety in multiple fields there. So where the conventional till was, the whole plant rotated, roots, stalk, and all, and went flat. And mine was able to stand up and hold it. So that was an interesting observation as well. And anyway, in more recent years, I didn't want to take a lot of stock in this 2020 year because of the added environmental complications there, but it was statistically equal down to 110 pounds. And so it appears that I'm at about 0.5 pounds of nitrogen per bushel. And this is a 250 bushel yield environment. And so in 21, I'll continue this investigation, but I've made, somewhere on the order of 80 to 100 pounds reduction in the amount of nitrogen that I've been able to reduce. And this is not because I've planted a lot of legumes or a lot of nitrogen producing type plants. I have had some of those species in there, but generally they've not gotten big enough to contribute much nitrogen. They just contributed on the ground cover. And so it's mostly a cereal rye and rapeseed species that I've had in there, but I've had them in there every year and continued to let them grow longer in the spring. And so I'm attributing it partially I probably was over applying even when I was doing conventional tillage, and partially because the bacteria and the biology is more active in the soil, and they're making some of that naturally occurring nitrogen available is my speculation on that. More recently, some of the recommendations that's come out of Iowa State would suggest that I should be applying about 150 pounds. So against current university, that's using the marginal rate of return to nitrogen. More recent would suggest that I'm just a little bit under their current recommendation, but I'm significantly under where I was 10 years ago. So I guess just some general soil health principles is cover the soil, and you can see I've got waist high cover crops there that I'm planting into. I've also planted into some that's been as tall as 6 feet tall. This is soybeans going into cereal rye with no reduction in yield, but that 6 foot tall rye is a lot of carbon. So minimizing soil disturbance, I think going to no-till certainly is a huge part of that, but no-tilling into a green cover crop, you just don't hardly move any soil at all. I mean, you move it sideways, but you're not stirring it up on the surface. And when you go through there, you're not creating any dust. I mean, the tires are just clean. So you certainly are having much less soil disturbance. Plant diversity. I also grow some cereal rye each year, mostly for my own use, but I also do some cover crop custom planting, and I'm able to sell some of that excess cereal rye into that custom operation. And behind that cereal rye, I come in with a summer mix that is very, very diverse. My specific species that I asked for was about a 7 or 8 way, but 25% of the mix was what I call floor sweepings from the seed company, broken bags or whatever. And so in that 25%, you could have lots of different species. But anyway, you got sunflowers, and it really made a pretty, to me, sight looking at that diverse mix out there. And the wildlife and butterflies and birds all really loved it as well. I could go out in there, and it was rare that I wouldn't scare up a deer or something like that, but you'd always see the butterflies out there. Maintaining continuous living plants and roots in there, and in both of the after the cereal rye harvest, putting that summer mix in there, there are some cool seasons, because part of it is that the smaller seeds that blow over the combine, that I'm not trying to capture all of it, it comes up volunteer. So I've got cereal rye growing underneath all of that as well. But even where I'm on the ground that I'm not growing the cereal rye, where I have the summer mix, getting that cereal rye planted early so that you have the roots and the ground as many days as possible. Integrating livestock, that's where I fall short, and as in some other presentations I've seen, is that, that what's missing. Well, in my operation, livestock is missing, but where I live, there's not much livestock available. And I've tried with a few neighbors that I know to get them to come and graze this, but I don't have livestock worthy fences and don't really have a water supply. Tried to get some hot wires and some of that stuff, but to date, I've not got anybody to take it even as free grazing. And so that's something I'm still working on, but I think it's important to have livestock back in the cycle as well. But at my age, I'm not gonna get into cattle operation. So that's part of the journey that I've been on, and it's been interesting, and I'm still learning, and hope to continue to work with this, getting more species or finding more species that can survive in that corn, so that we can have that growing together and looking at those operations. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Jack. We really appreciate you sharing your experience. And now we come to our last stop, on today's soil health journey. We're going to hear from soil health advocate, Dr. Steven Keleti, on healthy soils legislation and policy. Dr. Keleti has worked with different groups in many states across the country. And he's helped draft and advance healthy soils legislation. I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Keleti now to share a bit about what healthy soils legislation is, what it might mean for landowners and operators, some examples, and the current status of some of the various efforts going on around the country.
Hello, everyone. My name's again Steven Keleti. I help a lot of groups across the country. I got involved doing healthy soils policy only 4 years ago. Introduced with some people doing soil health then, and decided to do some by request legislation because I live in Massachusetts currently. I am originally from Missouri. And there's such a thing in some states like Massachusetts where one can do citizen initiated legislation. And from there, I started drafting legislation for other states because I understood the importance of it, especially with the Farm Bill going on at that time. And so it's been very wonderful to meet so many people who are doing such great work in this, including the people in the various soil and water conservation districts. So I want to start off with looking at what the current trends are with all the action that's been happening on the state level, which really helps complement the discussions and work at the federal and local levels. That's one thing that I noticed when going into the space was that there was a lot of activity at the very local level with various people working together on soil health, yet the problems of not having sufficient state support or awareness became clearer, and also it was not actually obvious how the federal legislators would respond because there's so little activity at the state legislature level. So during this time, we've seen a lot more action plans, pilot programs, and incentive programs. The NRCS, Natural Resource Conservation Service, this last year was going to have soil health strategies for every state, and those have been in process. A lot of them have been released, even though they're for many states considered somewhat internal documents still. The idea is to really start having more clear plans at the federal level, and having state action plans is helping. Pilot programs like the ones that were just described of people getting the data on improvement in soil health, et cetera, really helps legislators understand the costs and benefits of soil health programs so they can provide more funding for those incentive programs. We're seeing discussions on payment for ecosystem services, the idea that there's a lot more that is benefited to the public from soil health in terms of water quality, flood management, drought resilience, et cetera. There's a lot of trends towards really recognizing the importance of farmer-to-farmer training opportunities and funding people to do those trainings and to help give local assistance to other farmers who want to transition into doing more healthy soils practices. And we're seeing, even before the current news of the last year, there has been a lot of social equity and environmental justice in the writing of laws and in the programs. And so the attention on that has been increased, yet it's always been there as part of the legislation that's been worked on. We'll also talk about some of the opportunities. We've had a lot of regional collaborations, not just at the watershed level between counties, but also across various states. In the Northeast, we've seen a lot of states working together, like through the Northeast Organic Farming Associations, and across the Mississippi River, those states working together to see what policies work for each other and try to borrow policies or ideas from other adjacent states. We're seeing local ecosystem service areas. The idea of that is that trying to connect the people in various metropolitan areas that have to deal with water quality issues and those expenses, to divert expenses for water treatment, for example, to helping farmers with payment for the programs that they do in terms of cover crops and no-till, so that it's more efficient to deal with keeping the nutrients on the land than cleaning up the water afterwards. There's a lot of market incentive programs, and we've also given more attentions to the states that have funding for conservation programs in their state constitutions, for example, Missouri. The legislation is and work on moving policy is generally mostly farmer-led. It's the soil and water conservation districts have played a key role in getting the conversations going between the different groups. Some states, the conservation districts have started. In a lot of states, it's been the State Organic Farming Association or other farming groups like the Farmers Union or Young Farmers, who've been really interested in these topics and really want to move the conversation forward. In some parts of the country, it's been food policy groups because they see the higher nutrient content in food and the greater food security of having local food access through these programs that help small farmer profitability. Then there's the use of policy resolutions in the different organizations like Farm Bureau, Farmers Union, et cetera, because they've not been able to put as much policy attention on soil health because it's not part of the policy priorities. But many of these organizations over a few years have been talking to their members or leaving it into their policy priorities survey. And because of the shift towards having more support for soil health policy, we're getting more support in nonprofit organizations and moving policy forward. What's really great about soil health policy, it's bipartisan, nonpartisan. We're seeing bills submitted by farmer legislators of both parties, and we're seeing the bills pass unanimously in the states where they're passed. The main thing is to lead with is not the money about it because it is more profitable. The main thing is to lead with why. The increase in water holding capacity of healthy soils. For example, 1% increase of soil organic matter holds 20,000 more gallons per acre. That's huge. That makes or break difference in a lot of regions of the country of having crop loss or not. It also makes a huge difference in downstream flooding and flood mitigation. It reduces the runoff and protects the water quality by making sure the soil is a sponge for nutrients and holds onto those nutrients rather than running off. The healthy soils require less fertilizer because fertilizer use has tended to disrupt the fungal bacterial ratios. And so if the soil is healthy, and then the fungal and bacterial biome can properly supply the nutrients to the plants. When we have healthier soils, we have healthier crops. They're able to supply the nutrients better. When we have those nutrients able to come into the plant naturally, we're not having to spend as much money on artificial additives. And we're also able to reduce soil loss. In one study showed that for every pound of food, we lost 1.25 pounds of soil. So we've lost roughly 1/2 to 2/3 of our soils in the world, a lot in the Midwest. And we're seeing various areas of Iowa that are essentially lost all their topsoil. You can see the patches across the field. So if we're going to have food security, we need to rebuild soil and stop the soil loss. So it's a crucial thing to get ahead of this because it's estimated that we have about 60 years of crops left at the current rate of how we're losing soil. So one of the studies from National Association of Conservation Districts has shown this $100 per acre increase in profits, and these additional studies that are being done really help people get their eyes around what the improvements can be. So what the healthy soils legislation that we're seeing promotes the practices and the principles, which improve, like I mentioned, the drought resilience, the stormwater management, and the water quality while drawing down atmospheric carbon. A lot of focus lately on carbon drawdown, which is important, yet the major selling point in most states on soil health has been water. So we look at the ecosystem services, the value of all the water and other improvement environment things that the healthy soils provide, and you already can justify the funding for soil health programs with the carbon drawdown being a bonus. So this makes it very popular because you don't need to even talk about carbon, except soil organic matter is being as a good proxy for soil health, but it's not the focus. One of the great things about the soil health work is the framework. It's recognizing that most people don't get any bonuses for learning about stuff that's not part of their job. and legislators and staff are in a similar situation. So having a bill on the docket provides an opportunity to talk with legislators specifically about soil health and to give them an opportunity to answer their questions and give them information like it was given in the first parts of this presentation. So legislature and staff are giving those priorities to understanding the soil health. They'll even host briefings so that they can have these presentations, and then they can have the understanding that they need to move forward on either shifting funding or helping support action plans or pilot programs. So we've seen that happen a lot in Massachusetts. We didn't get very far with the bill initially, and but right off the bat, the state Executive Office of Environmental Affairs gave $100,000 from another fund to actually fund a soil health action plan. We see a lot of pilot programs being funded. For example, even in Illinois, when they were passing their bill in 2019, there was no funding associated with it, but simply the discussion around that bill resulted in $300,000 being allocated for cover crops. Here's a map of that I occasionally update and put out showing the status of things in the various states. We have the blue is states where things are pending for this coming session. We see a lot of bills are going to be submitted in Texas, in Colorado, and Montana this year. Bills resubmitted in Iowa, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. We're looking at that we're going to have bills in New York State and in Maine being submitted. So we're seeing a lot of movement. So the states labeled in green are the ones that have already passed legislation, and the ones in a sort of a lavender are the ones where there's a lot of activity moving towards legislation. Maybe half of those will probably also submit legislation this year. And then the salmon or peach color are the ones where we connected with folks who are interested in legislation, and it just takes a little bit more energy to get it to the next stage. So anyone listening on this, if you see this map, you can see where your state is at. If you want to engage in the conversation on soil health legislation in your state, feel free to reach out to me. What we found is that, like I mentioned before, we've had a lot of progress. It's been very exciting to be involved with this work and helping people move the conversation forward. It has been shown as to be an effective tool, this legislation. We're getting a lot more discussions percolating up through to the federal level, and it gives a lot of support to federal legislators when they can talk about the work being done at the state legislative level on soil health. We're seeing a lot of bills being submitted, like Shalise Pingree's Agriculture Resiliency Act. And those bills actually are starting to require there to be some sort of state healthy soils program in order to receive the federal money. So we're actually seeing a situation where it's not just a great idea for educating legislators, it's a great idea for receiving federal funding. In the last 2 years, we've seen legislation move forward and submitted in 21 states. That's a far increase. When we came into 2019, there were 6 states that had soil health bills: Oklahoma, Vermont, Utah, California, Maryland, and Hawaii. They were variously from getting funding from carbon program fees like California to doing study work like in Hawaii, which has resulted in numerous pieces of legislation. So on this slide is this Google group that I send out statuses to, and there's also a website that gives summaries of where things are at in every state, and healthysoilspolicy.org. So what's the process towards moving things forward? In most states, the organizations that have the strongest interest in soil health policy and legislation tend to be the soil and water conservation districts, because they're doing most of the work in this conversation. Sometimes it's the watershed associations and the food policy groups that are really the most interested because of various water quality issues or the tourism issues. There's a lot of problems with tourism loss because of nutrient and flood loss and such. So it's very important to see that that's another ecosystem benefit. If the rivers are healthy, then people want to come and visit. But the main thing is that the conversation doesn't really move forward unless the farming and ranching groups are involved. Frequently, we've had things stall a little bit if one group is too far ahead of the other groups. Things move much better when there's a coalition of folks working together on moving the bill forward. Legislators are much more receptive to seeing that this is just not a niche special interest piece of legislation, but it has a broad interest to a lot of different groups. The regional approach is also important. We're seeing a lot of work, for example, in the Northeast to look at these ecosystem services for payments for ecosystem services, and maybe even looking towards having a regional ecological services initiative that parallels the regional greenhouse gas initiative and the transportation and climate initiatives that are in the Northeast. Healthy soils legislation, when it first started out, was really mostly focused on agricultural soils, but in the bigger picture of ecosystems, it includes not just the agricultural soils, but it includes the urban soils, because one of the largest crop, the largest crop in the United States is the lawn. And so if we're going to really look at soil health, we also need to look at the health of the urban landscape soils. The bills in many states, they start off being focused on agricultural soils, and they now are expanding to really be inclusive of all soils, not just the agricultural soils. So including the health of the wetland soils, forestry soils, and the impacts to the local ocean and fisheries. Because when you see the impacts to the fisheries, then you can start to see that's less expensive to help the farmers with their soil health programs than it is to deal with the problems in the fisheries. So how does that work together? So we have various ideas. They sort of lay out a roadmap. There's various parts of things that can help soil health in a state. It can all kind of be under the umbrella of a soil health program, or it can be somewhat focused on a part of it. In terms of the broader picture, Vermont's been very much leading the way in a lot of these conversations. The Vermont Environmental Stewardship Program was very popular. Last year, they had the working group on payment for ecosystem services, which is really shifting the conversation to be more about healthy watersheds as well as healthy soils. We see, like in the draft legislation in Iowa last year, it was the Healthy Soils and Healthy Watersheds initiative. And the other bills are looking at the watersheds as being integral, because the watershed health is integral to the soil health. We're seeing a lot more funding for programs. The ACRE program in Massachusetts is for efficiency on farms, yet a lot of the money is going towards helping with roller crimpers for knocking down cover crops, row seeders, and other equipment that's needed to convert to healthy soils practices. We're seeing talk about fees on externalities. The externalities is when some activity is being done that other people end up paying for. And so one of the big impacts that other people pay for is nutrient runoff. So we're seeing some states really start to go towards having some fertilizer fees to go towards looking at soil health and its soil improvements. So for example, in Nebraska, they have a $1.76 per ton fee that goes directly for soil measurement and soil research by the University of Arkansas. So we're seeing a lot of programs for crop insurance, like in Iowa, being able to get that lower, on the $5 per acre on their cover crops as an incentive. We're seeing legislation to make sure that soil health under solar panels are being done, or there's agrivoltaics. In other words, having maybe pasturing or other vegetable crops under the panels. And we're seeing interest in looking at taking advantage of the federal 45Q, as it's called, carbon sequestration tax credit. That was originally designed for the oil and gas industry, but the way it's worded, it appears that it also can give the credit for avoided emissions, such as taking organics out of the waste stream and creating a product like compost. But it's very narrow, and other people working on specifically for a bill to do soil carbon sequestration. And so all these things require the understanding, like the pilot program, other programs, to get more soil testing data to establish the baseline for incentive programs. Some other parallel things that are happening that help support the soil health is some other ideas. For example, there's an ecological tax exemption. It's an idea that you essentially give a lower tax on properties that are providing ecological service, and the overall taxes stay the same, but that means that the land that's not providing as much ecological services are paying a little bit more on their tax rate. There's some ideas on food policy that because of the importance of healthy food, lowering healthcare costs, there's this notion of including soil health as part of the food policy. So for example, in the Massachusetts legislation, which may yet pass very soon, it was sent to the governor's desk this week of this recording, it includes someone on soil health on the Food Policy Council, so that the understanding of soil health is part of food policy. Then we're seeing forestry health is integrated also into bills, where it's just not about the agricultural land, but the health of the adjoining forests and how that impacts the lands. So I did mention before these local ecosystem service areas, so I'm going to say something briefly about that. The idea of these plants is to, on a watershed scale, looking at making sure that different farms and forests have some sort of plans for soil health, so that they get acknowledged for the work they're doing and get support that helps get local watershed visibility on where improvements are best managed or aided. It helps identify who in the region is doing the work, so it can facilitate farmer to farmer and rancher to rancher training support. And it also helps recognize where to best do pilots to either get baseline data for people who are just starting to transition, to getting, or gathering the data and documenting what people have already done, and to coordinate things to do better modeling and estimation. For example, there's a lot of work with OpenTeam and various other software. So if things are collected more synchronously, as well as close to when satellite imagery is collected, it's easier to do the modeling because the data on the ground gives better ground truth for the remote sensing imagery. And then the end result is getting these cost benefit data and support for the legislators to shift funding from programs that don't necessarily have the same cost benefit as soil health programs. Other ideas are increasing the buffer strips or decreasing if there's soil health. You don't need as much buffer strip if your field adjoining it is managed with soil health. There's just less nutrient runoff to capture. So you need to consider the field size, but there's an idea that's being floated around in some states like in Pennsylvania. There's additional support for particular practices. So we're seeing better results with multi-species cover crops. And we're seeing some discussion about a prohibition against using non-native microbiological species in soil amendments. What that means is a lot of interest in reinvigorating the soil biome by adding microbiological species. Yet we can see that, and we've seen in other areas, when you introduce a microbiological species, it can displace the native species and essentially extirpate the local larger species in the area. So it's very important to not spread microbiological invasive species. So I mentioned we have these local ecosystem services areas being created. It's been really helpful having these conversations at the Regional Association of State Departments of Agriculture, parts of NASDA. They've been very instrumental, I think, in having these conversations on a regional basis. And it's also been very helpful to work within the regional soil and water conservation districts to see what legislation is going on between the different states, because it's really in some areas on a watershed scale, very important, especially in the Southwest, in the Northeast, and along the Mississippi River basin. It's also, when we were talking, the transition has been going towards outcomes. So we want to have the setting of specific goals. One idea that gets floated around is, can we be net ecosystem positive and have 50% of land managed for soil health by 2025? Where can we go given the urgency of where we need to be as far as stopping the degradation of the land? So I mentioned we have the practices to outcomes. Formerly and still, there's a lot of legislation for particular practices, but it's much better to set up a program that promotes the soil health and the watershed health outcomes. For example, if we just had, I sometimes say, we don't measure human health just by muscle mass, and we shouldn't necessarily measure soil health by carbon mass. So there's other indicators. So it's better not to be so specific about what practices are being used, but to figure out, besides going to the gym, how you're going to improve your health. The goal is healthy soils and the related ecosystem services. So good legislation allows the flexibility in the implementation, includes getting the data to support continuing particular methods and practices and principles, and then using those practices to go to verifiable outcomes and rewarding those outcomes. There's a lot of market-based programs that's the transition, like the Soil Carbon Initiative starts with that, getting that baseline, doing basic practices, and then moving towards rewarding outcomes. Another big point is the fiduciary responsibility. We're going to see a huge transition in coming years towards of taking on healthy soils practices. It's really not really necessarily an option once the information is available. The loss of soil and soil health is a loss of land asset value. And so it's a fiduciary responsibility of a land manager, and 40% of agricultural land is leased. It's their fiduciary responsibility to protect, if not enhance, the value of the land assets under their management. Thus, this large portion of agricultural land will be put under healthy soils practice. So it's a great opportunity for soil and water conservation districts to disseminate the cost benefit data and these case studies like that have been created by the NRCS and the American Farmland Trust that help show land managers and landowners the importance of retaining their land asset values by incorporating soil health in their leases, and to help look towards using ecosystem health indexes rather than productivity indexes in determining their land value. I mean, the state, it's not displacing one with the other. It's really, can you augment and understand the value of your land based on its long-term sustainable health? So one way to pay for some things is on this negative externalities, like I mentioned. So one big negative externality is the overuse of fertilizers. And so most states do not collect significant fees on fertilizers, herbicides, pesticides, et cetera. And it's important to just note that it's not like there's any push to increase fees, but it's just worth noting that, because currently, if there's the tax on 18 cents a gallon on transportation fuels, there's the tax credit under 45Q of roughly $100 a ton of avoided carbon emissions. Basically, 1 ton of fertilizer produces roughly 9 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions between the nitrous oxide, greenhouse gas, the emissions from creating the fertilizers, et cetera. So if fertilizers had a fee on them equivalent to what the government puts on transportation fuel, or is given back under the 45Q tax credit, the fees on fertilizers would be around $180 a ton. In most states, the fee is around 25 cents to $1, with a few exceptions. So the idea is that just acknowledging that, it's important to see that we know that there's a lot of external costs that aren't being paid for. And even if there's no fee, if people understand that it does have an impact, they'll try to find ways of reducing the amount of their use. In terms of tax theory and economic theory, it's always a good idea to collect some sort of fee, not a tax, because it doesn't go to the general revenue fund, but a fee specifically for mitigating those impacts as close as possible to what they call the nexus or the source. For example, fees collected on transportation has been proposed. Fuels is supposed to be used to convert for higher efficiency cars. It's the most efficient because it's addressing the source. So getting close to here, just to summarize, the main things that would be great to work for in every state is to make sure there's a complementary healthy soils action plan it's complementary to the National Resource Conservation Service's Healthy Soils strategies. It's important to have healthy soils pilot programs, or augment or build upon what's already going on in the state as far as pilot programs. It's important to get the cost benefit data from the farmers and ranchers so that people have visibility as to how it can help the profitability, and to have a program that has money for helping make the transition to soil health practices. And it's important to at least have a conversation and consideration of the fees on externalities, and to try to figure out some way of compensating farmers for the services that they are providing through how they manage the land. Some notes on moving forward. Most of the difficulties that I've seen in the states is due to doubt and delay, not to any substantial opposition. There's no groups that oppose healthy soils policy. Most are very strongly supportive. As I mentioned, like Farmers Union, various organic farming associations. Farm Bureau has been very supportive, giving testimony in support of bills and being involved in some of the drafting of some of the legislation. It's important to start with the farmers and farm groups and really have their voice in the forefront, because it's really helpful in structuring a program of a particular state to acknowledge and deal with the specific gaps that farmers are dealing with, whether it's in equipment, supports, or market access, or price stability for their products. A lot of farmers would like to transition to soil health programs, but feel a little up against it because they're at the risk of bankruptcy. It's important to make sure the language is not divisive. Some people in the organic community prefer considering regenerative agriculture being that which supports things beyond organic. And a lot of conventional farmers see the term regenerative agriculture as trying to push them to be organic. And that's not the case at all. But just to keep things from being a hot button reaction, there is common ground with using the word healthy soils. Due to the soil water connection, as I mentioned before, it's very helpful to have watershed health included in the legislation, and also to incorporate legislation to help forestry and other urban soils. And then it's important to build the state and regional collaborations, working towards making sure that bills are sponsored or submitted by legislators of both parties, and to make sure that the soil and water conservation districts and the departments of ag are on board. It sometimes delays things when the Department of Ag isn't part of the conversation, so they can better understand how the program might be administered. So thank you very much for your time, and I appreciate all the work everyone does on improving soil health, and I look forward to being of help to whoever would like it.
Thanks so much, Steven. As he mentioned, be sure to visit the website healthysoilspolicy.org for the latest healthy soils policy information across the country. And with that, we've completed our soil health journey for today. Thank you for joining us.